Okay. Right. Well, I have to say welcome to this first webinar that Sandbag's ever held. So hopefully people are still dialing in. If there are any problems, Phil is standing by to try and help people. And we have got an ability to take comments, so we'll be able to see. Please type in if there's something wrong. It's been quite a few weeks of hard work to get all this sorted out. So let's hope technology is kind to us and this works. So I'm going to start by just saying a few words and to introduce Dave here, who's sitting to my left. We're here today to discuss our report, which we launched today, and this report is the culmination of, well, several months worth of new research by Sandbag, where we've pulled together a new data set enabling us to do some more deep dive analysis on the European power sector. People who know us, know Sandbag of old, will know that for many years we've been looking at the data provided by the ETS. In this report, we've supplemented that with more information about the power sector, those combustion plants that are in the ETS cap. And that has been a process of gathering data and information and making it available so that we can classify different power stations by fuel type. And that means we can do now a much more detailed analysis of what's happening to coal emissions in the EU. Coal-based power emissions in the EU. It also enables us to look at what's happened to gas and the other thermal generators in the system. And we've also looked at quite a lot of work went into assessing the impact of air quality regulations on those stations. So we've also now got a data set which, bottom up, we've looked at how many of those stations are going to be operating unaffected by air quality, and what are the options for those stations going forward. So this has been quite a considerable piece of work, and it's all been undertaken by Dave here, who has joined Sandbag recently, having been an analyst and a trader for E.ON. So that's someone who understands the system from the inside. So I'm going to stop talking in a second, and Dave's going to talk us through some of the main findings in our report. As I say, we will, I hope, have Phil standing by for anyone who's having trouble hearing us or any other technical glitches. And I look forward to hopefully what will be a really good discussion. After Dave has spoken, we have got several people standing by who will present some comments on the report from their perspective, and they're coming from different parts of Europe. And then we will open it up for questions that people can pose, and I think we can have up to 10 people speaking in this format. So it's a new invention for us to use this, so we hope it goes well. And I'm now going to hand over to Dave. Okay, thank you.
Hello, good morning. Thanks, Bryony, for the introduction. Just to kind of introduce the report and where we're coming from. There's a lot of policymakers out there that are basically keep reiterating that coal increasing at the moment is a very temporary problem, and really the purpose of this report was try to look a bit more into that to say how temporary is this problem. Is it likely to go away in the next couple of years, or is it really a scourge that will stay with us for quite a long time? I mean, just to kind of give a headline about the report and our findings, we found that over the last 3 years, coal emissions have risen by 6% across the EU. They're now, just coal emissions by themselves, are now 18% of CO2 emissions for the whole of the EU. So that's really a huge number. Our belief is that if the EU climate policy can't deal with coal generation, then there really is a problem with it. What I'd really like to do now is I'm going to switch over to some slides just to talk through some of the analysis, just so that give a bit of structure to this and answer some people's questions, hopefully. We have a feed here with all the questions coming in, so please fire some questions at us as you go along, and we'll answer them as we go along, hopefully. I guess like a broader place to start really is with generation in total before we move on to coal. Hopefully you can see this graph now. Looking at Phil. This graph basically describes the picture more broadly from a power sector basis, and it's worth just having kind of a few minutes talking through this to see where we start from. So if we look at the blue bars, you can see that power demand growth is basically falling in every country. So electricity demand in every country in the EU is basically falling. For the whole of the EU, it's just under 1% that it's falling by every year. Renewables are on the orange bar. So everyone talks about Germany, about renewables coming on in Germany, but you can see from the bars here that every single country, their renewables program is now well underway, and there's decent renewables growth in every country. So across the whole of the EU, over the last 3 years, renewables came online every year at an average rate that was basically offsetting demand by 1.5%. So between the demand falling and the renewables coming online, residual generation is basically falling by 2.4% every year over the last 3 years, which is pretty immense, and surprised me quite a lot when I started this analysis. The next point is then to map that on fossil generation. So as generation is falling, that hydro and nuclear is basically relatively stable in all of this. So that across the EU that a lot more of that reduction in generation will be met with the fossils. So you can see from that line there, you can see across the whole of the EU that fossil generation fell 4.4% every year for the last 3 years. They're huge numbers. There's a huge variation across the countries. So you can see in Germany where nuclear has come offline, that's basically offset the demand for the renewables coming online. So their fossil is actually pretty unaffected. At the other extreme, you've got a country like France, which has got relatively little fossil generation. So when demand's falling, when renewables is coming online, that's really making a big difference in percentage terms to their fossil. So that's a bit of a background about the kind of broader mix, which is fossil generation falling 4.4%. So what's happened specifically to coal? So like Brian said, what we've done is we've gone through the EU ETS database, and we've basically mapped the fuel type for every single EU ETS installation out there, identified which are for the power sector, and then which are coal, gas or oil on top. And basically from the coal ones, what we found is that emissions have actually been rising through all of this. So from 2010 to 2013, they increased by 6%. The reason for the fall from 12 to 13 was actually really two issues. One was the fact that LCPD plant was coming offline, and we'll talk about that in a minute. The second one was it was a very dry year in Spain, where coal generation really spiked up for 1 year in Spain. So rising coal emissions, what does that mean for gas? Obviously gas has reduced immensely. So you can see the two bars on the left here, from 2010 to 2013 you lost 250 terawatt hours of gas generation, which is absolutely immense. And then in all of that, coal generation has actually increased by 50 terawatt hours. So there's been a huge underlying shift in the relative amounts of coal and gas generation going on here, even as the overall load reduces. I mean, the way that we like to picture it was quite simple. We basically said if you had gas generation staying at the same level as 2010, then you'd end up with an awful lot lower coal emissions than you have now, and the whole of the EU power sector will be 11% lower than it is now. Just to kind of end the introduction, I guess, before we get into a couple of finer points, there's the issue, which is the kind of missed opportunity of the coal-gas switching now, but there's a bigger issue as well. The bigger issue is the fact that these cuts could become more permanent. So there's two sets of decisions that's going on at the moment by power stations. The first one is on coal stations, whether they decide to comply with future EU legislation, which is the industrial plant emissions directive, which we'll come on to in a minute, and the second one for the gas plant, which is predominantly unprofitable against its fixed costs. And there's a question about how quickly that may be mothballed, and there's been obviously a lot of closures over the last couple of years already, and utilities have plans to close an awful lot more. So let's just get a little bit more detail into coal emissions specifically. So Germany's basically got the largest coal emissions out of every country. Germany accounts for 36% of total coal emissions. The UK and Poland are next up at 15%. And this is important. Why is this important? Because coal generation is 39% of the total ETS. So Germany is really a big emitter just on this metric alone. UK and Poland are filling that up to 66% of the total, and every other country has a kind of a small amount of coal generation there, but they're much less big emitters by comparison. And really, this report focuses a lot of the details on those three biggest emitters. Before you have a look at how the coal emissions have grown, this gives a bit of a sense of things. Germany up 7% over the last 3 years, the UK up by a massive 19%, Poland up a little bit, and everyone else is more than less stable.
Just delay a minute, just because their slides are taking a while to update, I think.
Ah, okay.
Okay, well,
I'm hoping you caught up with the slides here. The slides may be not reflecting exactly what I'm saying. There's a bit of a delay with the slides coming through, but when the slides come through, hopefully they'll you can piece the two together in your mind.
Do we need to refresh anything, Dave, Phil? Because we've got the feed there. If that's what they're looking at, it'd be quite hard for them to follow.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see this in the report anyway. If we go through a breakdown of the UK coal emissions and how the UK coal emissions have developed, they've shown the biggest increase of 19% across the last 3 years.
I think, yeah, you could probably skip. Let's just.
There we go.
Is that working now?
No, that's what everyone else is seeing.
What are you saying over there?
So yeah, the same as now.
It looks like we are having a bit of a technology hitch, which is that you're seeing a version of our screen that is not full screen. So it's basically a delay, I think. We're sorry about this. Hopefully it's still, if you have the report in front of you, which is on our website now, so at sandbag.org.uk, you can get the whole PDF. Should be live.
Okay. Well, this is what they can see.
And now you can see that. So now
So
don't dwell on this one though, it's too detailed.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So I mean, you can see where UK coal emissions have been. There's some. I'll skip through the country specifics, and if anyone wants to ask any questions, we can answer them now or go into those later. I mean, the key thing to pull off really that we've really been concentrating on our report is what's happening under the EU air quality legislation. So that started, well, it started with LCPD, but LCPD has been one of the major impacting factors. And hopefully when the graph comes up, if it's not up already, you can see we've basically plotted out the emissions from LCPD opt-out power stations, and as they've been closed in the last few years, how those power stations have been reducing their emissions. By 2013, they'd got down to 3% of the total coal emissions. So really, by 2013, they're more than less all closed already. And then basically they need to be offline by December 2015, so they're slowly dwindling down towards 2015. The biggest thing really to concentrate on is the impact of the Industrial Emissions Directive. So I don't know how much everyone knows about that, but really it's about primarily it's about investment in NOx technology. So LCPD was about getting the sulfur dioxide emissions down through FGD investment. IED is mostly about getting the NOx emissions down. So most policymakers were thinking that everyone needed to install SCR, which is selective catalytic reduction, which is quite an expensive outlay, about 180 million euros a gigawatt. And that will be enough to end up with a lot of the coal power stations, the least efficient coal power stations shutting. So what we've done is basically a bottom-up analysis to try to figure out people's investment decisions and what this might mean for future of coal. So The slide that hopefully you can see now is basically a list of the gigawatts in each country, and a bit of a commentary really on what our expectation is about how people are going to comply with IED. The headline for Germany is basically that there was national legislation in place a few years ago, so virtually all plants have got to a stage of having their NOx emissions already reduced to the levels of IED. So for Germany, we expect to see a very small impact. Poland's a very different story. So Poland's in a very uncertain position at the moment, where all the generators kind of have plans to get there, but those plans are really based around government officials trying to lobby to water down the IED proposals. So there's all sorts of things that have happened already more broadly. There's a transitional national plan that's been implemented, which has reduced which has reduced the implementation to middle of 2020. So that's put the whole of the implementation of IED back by 4.5 years. But also there's lots of small things going on with Poland where they're trying to negotiate and wiggle the way out of compliance. So it's very uncertain what those power stations are doing at the moment, and what it really needs is a lot more focus on the Polish policy, and to try to make sure those power stations are really doing what they're meant to be doing, which is either installing decent investment in there to really get their NOx emissions down, or coming off the system. For the UK, it's a very interesting story. Ratcliffe which is 2 gigawatts, has invested into SCR. Drax is more than likely with its biomass to comply. That leaves 14 gigawatts undecided. 14 gigawatts is a huge amount lying in the balance. And what we found is that most stations are basically still hedging their bets. So of all those stations, most of them have opted into the transitional national plan, which is into IED, and they've also opted into the limited life derogation, which is out of it. So at some point by the end of 2015, they need to make a decision one way or another. So there's a real tipping point on the UK at the moment of 14 gigawatts. As you go through the rest of the countries, it's a bit of a mix where the biggest power stations have all made investments already or committed to make investments, and there's a few kind of wavering around in the background for the rest of them that still haven't fully committed one way or another. So the way that we see it, there's 40 gigawatts in total of power stations. The way we define it is of power stations that haven't made that investment decision yet. So it's very unclear what the impact of IED will have. In the report there's a discussion about the technologies, and our conclusion from all of that is there's a lot of technologies and a lot of ways that can be done to get within the IED limits. So there's a lot of ways that that could swing this 40 gigawatts to actually be compliant and come online. So it's very unclear at the moment how all of this will go through, and it's really to try to alert policymakers to this issue at the moment to make sure the situation doesn't get any worse. In the case of the UK, that situation is a little bit worse. So in the UK at the moment, the capacity market coming online is giving a big incentive to keeping coal online, not just through annual payments, but through up to 15-year capacity contracts, which is crazy if you consider how capacity contracts, how much you need a capacity contract to be able to build a new power station or invest. 15 years is really a long time to be able to put into that. So what we also have is on one side of the coal coming off, and maybe it will, maybe it won't, we have the gas. The gas is mostly not covering its fixed costs in many countries, and there's an awful lot of gas that could be coming off the system that may or may not be coming off the system. So between these two issues, there's an awful lot of uncertainty to the generation mix going forward. So I mean, really, it's then to move on to the policy side. thinking how we deal with all of that. So maybe I just hand over to Bryony just to go through a bit of the policy options that we've discussed and what might be happening with those.
Okay. Apologies, everybody. I think this has probably been a bit hard to follow, given that the slides are delayed, and let's just say this is our first time, and it will be better next time. What we've done in this report, as Dave has outlined, is done a very detailed look at both what's been happening in the power sector in the EU and looked at trying to model what will happen in the future. And as Dave said, one of the key things we find is that it's all very uncertain, and that the current climate and energy policy that is operating in Europe has not got to grips with carbon intensity of our power sector. It's done a good job of bringing forward renewables and demand reduction, and up to 2020 that's going to continue. But what it's been less good at is ensuring that we are maximising the efficiency of our thermal plant, that we're using our cleaner plant ahead of our more polluting plant. In fact, it's not been able to do that at all, given where coal and gas prices have been. Now, I think there's a general feeling amongst policymakers that this is a short-lived thing and that it's not going to be a problem, it will resolve itself. We are concerned that that's not the case. Having looked at some of the air quality regulation requirements, we think there's an awful lot of flexibility there. And so we can't rely on air quality necessarily bringing coal off. So really it's down to economics and whether we ever think coal prices are going to get to a low enough level, gas prices are ever going to get to a low enough level that they can resume their place in the merit order. And now the key policy parameter that we have that influences that, of course, is the carbon price as set by the ETS. And what we're concerned about is that this decade is the decade in which a lot of investment decisions will be made on coal. And in this decade, we have got a very low carbon price at around 5 to 6 euros. And it could get even lower as the backloading measures bring more allowances back towards the end of this decade. And there's a very real risk that at just the precise time that power companies are assessing what to do with their coal, they are looking at still high gas prices and a very low carbon price, which makes them decide in favour of investment in coal and to the detriment of gas. And what we're worried about is that those decisions, which will happen probably as late as 2018, will then lock in our emissions profile going forward into the next decade. So in the context of our 2030 discussions around our energy and climate package, we've got to look at this impact of a low carbon price now on investment decisions that will then help to fix what's possible into the next decade. So we, in our report, did look at some of the policy options that are available to policymakers, and we've outlined some of them. They can operate at either a member state level or at an EU level, and there's an awful lot more work, I think, needing to be done to consider what are the best options going forward. One option is that we simply just rely on the UK, Germany and Poland introducing domestic measures that ensure that they are investing in carbon capture and storage and lower forms of thermal generation than coal. If we want to do something at an EU level, the most obvious thing that needs to be done is the fixing of the ETS and getting the carbon price off the floor. But that has to be done sooner rather than later if it's going to send the right signals to those investors. Now that's easier said than done. There are a number of measures on the table already, the market stability reserve, and then a whole package of potential changes under the 2030 package. But we're absolutely clear that if we want that carbon price to be fixed and to help stop this lock-in to coal, it needs to be done quickly. If it's not, and we may want to look at this anyway, there are other policies that could be introduced at an EU level that will help to ensure that we are getting off coal and supporting more low-carbon generation. Now, this won't come as news to anyone, but obviously the 2030 package, as it's being discussed, is very different to the 2020 package. The legally binding element of renewables is on member states has been lost, we think, probably permanently. There is an energy efficiency target, but again, there's question marks as to how much that can be made to bite on member states. So we might not see those trends that our report highlights of renewables really now starting to encroach on thermal continuing in all countries. I'm sure certain countries will carry on, and but others won't. With the loss of those binding targets at an EU level, certain member states might want to roll back. So in the absence of those legally binding targets on renewables energy efficiency, we think there's definitely merit for exploring EU level binding measures that look at carbon intensity. And we say that because that carbon intensity focus has, I think, been sorely lacking in the EU policy package at the moment. If you look at our report, we've produced a league table of the carbon intensity of all the different power sectors in the EU countries, and there are certain countries at the top of that table you would probably be wanting to see coming lower down. Having invested so much in renewables and energy efficiency, Germany, Denmark and the UK are still stubbornly high in terms of carbon intensity because of this coal problem. So we think the new Commission coming in should look carefully at carbon intensity and use that as a clear measurement of progress in the 2030 package, and should look at whether more binding measures are needed on carbon intensity of power. And there are a number of options that could do that, including looking at putting efficiency standards back onto thermal plant, or looking at how suppliers are regulated to insist that suppliers are supplying ever lower carbon intensive electricity. And in that respect, that might be interesting because it would be similar to what we've tried to do on car regulation standards. So we've put a few options on the table, and we also have made some recommendations of what we need to see happen straight away. And that's really, as I've said, urgent reform of ETS, the fact that carbon intensity reporting should be now much more front and centre of EU policy. We absolutely need to see more CCS support, particularly in those countries who are very reliant on coal, and really Poland is the most obvious country to which that applies. And the last recommendation, which was written before yesterday's state aid announcement on the UK's capacity market, was that state aid should be clearly clarified to say that any capacity mechanism support takes into account the carbon intensity. Now, that's obviously not been the case in the UK's case, and that might be an argument that we have lost temporarily. But the policymakers do need to understand the impact of capacity mechanism payments on carbon going forward. So I think we will wrap up there and now move into another experimental stage where we see if we can get our commentators to join us and for them to provide some responses to the paper. So Phil's going to now work his magic.
Or not. I'm not sure if it's gonna.
We're just going to put on mute for 1 second. Okay, I think we are sadly going to have to admit defeat on being able to get our people to join us. If there's anybody on from our invited speakers who can post questions, we will repeat them and comments, sorry, I should say, and we can then take those. Other than that, I think if you want to post anyone, you can post questions and we'll answer them. We've had a few already. One question was about, received from Mark Johnson, was about the legality of what the member states, what the EU is able to do to regulate coal emissions. And this is a common question, and I know that under the EMR, when the UK was looking at introducing its emissions performance standard on coal, this was a question raised: are member states allowed to go further on carbon than the current ETS requires? And the legal opinion received from the UK at that point was yes, we could, and that there were specific provisions put in to the ETS regulations to say that member states could go further than was required under the ETS. And I know that this is a very pertinent discussion at the moment in Germany, where there are discussions and consultations ongoing about what to do about its rising emissions from coal. And a common held view by industry is that that Germany's hands are tied. We don't believe that's the case, and in the UK certainly we've been able to show that we can move forward and introduce specific policies that supplement the ETS. And of course, the other thing that member states maintain is the ability to introduce supplementary taxes, and that's already in place in the UK, where we have a carbon price floor, but we also have seen in Holland a coal tax that was introduced temporarily on coal. So there are obvious legal parameters that can be, there's parameters within which member states and the EU can move to do something about the coal problem. Phil, could you do me a favour and look through questions and then relay them to us? Because I see there was a number there. That's.
Wait, there's one.
Okay, yeah. So we've got a question from Adam White here about what was the reason why LCPD emissions in 2012 spiked. And Dave, I'm sure you can happily answer that one.
Yeah. I mean, basically it was just stations using up their hours before they went offline. The coal gas differential really spiked up in 2012, gave some really attractive dark spreads. The likes of Didcot and Kingsnorth really accelerated their coal burn, and then ended up shutting early. So basically, by March 2013, that was the last. Sorry, March 2014, that was the last LCPD opt-out power station to shut in the UK, just because coal becomes so much more attractive. All the hours were used earlier, and all the stations ended up shutting slightly earlier, and that meant a spike up in 2012. And 2013 came off an awful lot in 2014, or we've actually zero.
Hopefully that answers the question. We've had another question from Mark about what entities could carbon intensity requirements apply to. The answer to that is those entities that lawmakers decide, obviously, in the 2030 package. One potential regulatory point would be on suppliers of electricity. The reason this is interesting is that since 2005, suppliers of electricity into the EU market have been required to report the carbon footprint of their supply. And that applies to all of the suppliers registered in the EU. It's not really, very much is done with this. League tables are published, and we get regular annual updates in the UK on the carbon intensity of supplied electricity. At an EU level, it's a kind of a forgotten piece of the regulatory framework that isn't, not much is done with it. So we think that a good place to start might be to look there. And the advantage of maybe doing something like that is it would create a pull market from suppliers to generators in all low carbon technologies. So it would help to make sure that renewables had an attractive market and can get power purchase agreements, as much as it would also help to make suppliers switch back from coal to gas. So it could be an effective policy. Be very interested to hear people's feedback on that and views. And we have a question from Andrzej, excuse me for getting your surname wrong, Bełchatow, and he asks, how much interactions did you have with KW and Polish policymakers while working on this? Dave, you spoke to some people in Poland?
Yeah, I mean, you had a few comments from a few different places, and it's the same message everywhere, which is that which is just millions of questions over the TNP and how the Industrial Emissions Directive will come in, but more importantly, how that feeds into the broader discussion on Poland. And what happens with new build, and there's so many different pieces to the puzzle with all of that, that in the case of the UK, the IED probably is the one main puzzle. In Poland, IED is very it's only one very small piece of the puzzle. There's 10 gigawatts of new coal that's being planned at the moment for Poland. And there's all sorts of ways that may or may not be encouraged, and what happens with that sits alongside with investment plans for IED, and it sits alongside the German energy policy in total.
I think one of the things we were really found quite curious is exactly how member states are approaching the IED, and I think it's fair to say that the Polish interpretation of the rules is slightly different, and what we see is that where the IED is causing investment, there's an awful lot of use of as many flexibilities as possible to ensure that the bubble of NOx emissions is as high as possible and that decisions are delayed as long as possible. I mean, this is not perhaps a surprise, but this is what happens when you have a highly technical policy in which the information and is held by industry, and you have perhaps member states whose main aim is to water down and support their incumbent power companies. They will assist the companies in making sure it's as flexible as possible. We see that in the UK. We've certainly seen it in Poland. I suspect in Germany they were probably a bit more organised, and in 2009 issued an ordinance that said all plants will comply, and that's pretty much what's happened. So this is really an issue of UK and Poland in terms of IED. Now then, has anyone else got any questions? This bit at least is working. We can see your questions, and we are able to respond to them. So please do. I think anyone who hasn't been able to see the presentation, which I think might be many of you, the website should have a copy of the presentation and the press release. We will email around the presentation after this with some notes so that it can be interpreted. Even if it's just feedback, actually, rather than questions, please do send us your thoughts. Particularly from those of you we asked to contribute but have been unable to find on this system. I'm sorry about that, but if you wanted to say anything, please do. At the moment we have a lot of comments from just a couple of people, so let's see if we can broaden this debate a bit further. No? Are you? I can see that there's quite a few of you still out there.
There's one here from Thomas Spencer.
Ah, excellent. Thomas Spencer. Thanks for the great report. Can the EU, what can the EU do to govern capacity mechanisms? Well, that's a good question, and as we saw yesterday, despite having some guidelines which might give you some hope that they would call in capacity mechanisms and challenge member states, the first test of those has been the UK's capacity mechanism, and we haven't seen the detail of the ruling, but it does seem to be giving a green light. And that's our concern, is that those guidelines are obviously very easily interpreted in a very wide way. And what we've got in the UK is a policy mechanism that could, I'm not saying it will, but it could hand a massive lifeline to about 14 gigawatts of existing coal. And that's what Dave was alluding to.
Yeah, I mean, the European Commission have come out and said that every capacity mechanism needs to be approved by them before it goes through, which is useful in a way. We thought there was quite a strong argument with the UK in itself on the argument of how necessary is it, on the argument of exactly the mechanism of the auction, which had a few issues with, and on the issues of demand response and interconnection, where there were some kind of very big unanswered questions around that, and all three of those kind of we thought put it in breach of how Europe wanted a capacity mechanism implemented. Unfortunately, they approved it anyway, but future capacity mechanisms all need to go through that process of being approved by the European Commission. So, so what hasn't worked for the UK may work for other countries.
Yes, someone's just commented that it's a pity that the questions are not time-stamped, because we're finding it quite difficult to actually see who's added something new. So that there are some definite wrinkles in this presentation that we will iron out for any future events. Okay, new question from Matteo, Matteo was going to join us earlier, and is from ENI in Italy, and Matteo says, agree that the idea is flexible and a lot of investments are focused on making coal plants compliant. In Italy, the impact is marginal. Yeah, I think, Dave, you would agree with that, wouldn't you? We looked at Italy and realised that actually there's not a lot of change there.
Yeah, I mean, by comparison against other countries, there's obviously not that much coal generation in the mix anyway, predominantly driven by gas. But also Enel decided a long time ago that they wanted to invest in their plants, and therefore they have plans to make sure a lot of their plant will be IED compliant.
Yeah, but what I would say, Matteo, is that I guess gas. There are two sides to our report. One is there's a story of growth in coal and a potential for reinvestment in coal, and the other is gas really being squeezed off by fundamental structural changes in the EU's energy markets and a very, very low carbon price. And so I think that, to the detriment of our carbon intensity. And I'm kind of interested to know how gas companies view this going forward. Is there anything that they should be calling for? We would hope that gas companies are calling for a stronger carbon price, but it'd be interesting to hear any other views on that. Okay, another new question. Why not? This is from Tricia, who's actually a Sandbag volunteer. So thanks, Tricia. Why not an EU-wide carbon intensity regulation for power as part of the 2030 package? That does seem like a question that we might have asked her to ask. I mean, we are interested in this, and that's something we wanted to highlight in this report, which is why we focused on carbon intensity and produced the league table, and have also made that one of our recommendations. It is a good measure of how well we're doing in terms of moving forward on getting our power sector emissions down, so that we can use then power for decarbonising transport and decarbonising heat. And we don't think enough attention is put to this by policymakers. So we would love to see something that took a requirement that's already there on suppliers and made that more visible. We are interested in looking at energy performance standards that could apply at a generation level, and there are precedents for that in the UK and Canada, and now of course in the US as well. So very interested in people's views. I think it was a missed opportunity within the 2030 package, and the UK, as we all know, was arguing quite strongly against renewables targets being binding, but it failed to argue in favour of carbon intensity or decarbonisation targets being binding, and I think that was a missed opportunity. And really, we need to see member states coming forward with sub-GHG targets that help us to make sure that the power sector is decarbonising and going first. Dave, do you have any comments on that?
No, not really. No, I mean that covers most of it, doesn't it?
Sorry, I can stop talking.
Yeah, so there's a question from Thierry about what we're doing to promote it. So I mean, we have circulated this to a lot of people already, and it's up on the website. I don't know what I'm hoping that it just kind of gets retweeted around. If you'd like to retweet it, please retweet it, and get as many people looking at it as possible. It contains quite a lot of wealth of information in there, I hope. If there's any follow-up questions people have, my email address is on there. Please get back to me, and I'd be more than happy to answer any questions coming from that at all.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, we are a small organisation, as you probably all know, or if you don't, then you should know, because Sandbag is really only 4.5 people. So, and we think what we're good at is doing the analysis and getting the data, and hopefully providing interesting reports. We always very much value help from others in terms of then spreading that message. We ourselves will take a kind of an advocacy route, so we will go and talk to new staff, new members of the new commission, and to the new parliament members, and try and make sure that this is widely understood. We'll also obviously engage with member states who are particularly well connected to the UK, but yes, it is important to get this message. I just noticed that Matteo had come back and said that he agreed that there was a missed opportunity, and he thought that the number in the report that was most significant was the 11% number, which is the number, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, that we've missed out, the emissions we could have saved if gas had been higher up the merit order.
Yeah, we haven't gone into detail about that, but it's worth mentioning now that because as you have more and more renewables on the system, you need more excess. The plant that's there will be running a lower load factor because it's still needed there for kind of the cold, dark days in winter. And what that means is that actually, as you go through time, the coal gas potential actually ends up increasing because you have so much more plants sat around with the ability to switch from one fuel into the other fuel. So it's really necessary that policymakers know that, and that you get that fuel mix set up right now.
Thank you for that question, Thierry. We've just had a question about where the presentation can be downloaded from. I'm afraid the presentation can't be downloaded at the moment because we haven't put it up yet, but you can download the full report, and the press release is on our website. So if you go to sandbag.org.uk, it should be on the home page. So we had another question, I think, about CCS and whether limited support from NGOs on CCS, whether that helps coal continue. Well, I mean, I suppose as an organisation that tries to remain remain technology neutral, we do support CCS, and we think it's got a very important role to play. The failure of the ETS doesn't just relate to carbon prices today, but it also meant that you didn't get enough money to then go into CCS demonstration projects, which was another problem of the low carbon price. And so that's been very slow, and another real kind of weakness in the 2020 package. So we would like to see the 2030 package address that, and I think targeting our support at those countries who are most carbon intense would be a good policy, and try and ensure that we do see CCS in countries like Poland, where as I understand it, at various different levels in Poland, there is some support, and certainly some of the individual power stations have in the past expressed interest, and we know that there were stations bidding in for that NER money, but none have been successful. So that might be that's, I think, should be a formal part of the 2030 package, that the CCS aspect of it is really looked at and given a lot more emphasis.
Yeah, another part to the Poland jigsaw.
Yes, indeed. Matteo has asked another question. On Italy, on average, 4,500 hours per year of coal plants. So, Matteo, you might want to help us to clarify what you mean there, but I presume that means that you've got, yes, and gas power plants on average. So, really, you've got coal base loading and gas being the marginal plant, which I think we had already understood. But we chose to focus on UK, Germany and Poland in the report, partly just through lack of time and resource, but partly because those are the biggest players. So we are aware that there are coal switching potentials in other countries, but that the politics of that is quite different.
Mm.
So Keith Allett, ECF, has got a question. Have you been able to assess the impact of potential future emission standards, e.g. under LCP BREF processes?
I mean, the first thing to pick up on that is that one of the major things that's being discussed at the moment is on the NOx levels. So we spent a lot of time talking about IED. IED has a limit of 200 milligrams for NOx emissions. The best available technology is 80 milligrams using SCR, and one of the issues that there may be so much kind of cheaper investment going on at the moment is the fact that there's other ways to get to 200, but there's only one way to get to 80. So one of the discussions going on at the moment is getting that NOx limit down to 80, which would be very useful, and basically force people to put SCR in their stations rather than just putting a kind of half-assed attempt to try to get within a certain bubble in a certain way through frigging the numbers.
Yes.
I mean, there's many other things that have come in as well, and like obviously you're aware of, Keith, everyone's aware of, like on the Dirty 30 report that came out earlier this week, calling for some mercury limits to come in to get around the problem of mercury emissions, which would be really expensive to come to. And really, when you look through the power station decisions now, this is not only about IED. So, for example, in the UK, the one power station that decided to stay alive in the UK and invest in SCR, they didn't just build SCR. That was Ratcliffe. They spent almost €1 billion refurbishing and relifing the whole station. So that was on a variety of things that were bringing the pollutants down, which meant that, and increasing the efficiency, which meant that they're not just complying today, but they know they can comply in the future. Because that is one of the uncertainties, is just to get under like a bar today is no good if someone then lowers the bar for tomorrow. And that in itself is clear that is creating some uncertainty for the coal generators and reducing their chances of investing for sure.
Yeah, it's I mean, this kind of slow progression of EU air quality regs has been, has had an effect on coal. The LCPD, as we saw, has shut off plant. The IED has asked them to do certain things, but in a very flexible way. And now we hear that the next round of setting of NOx limits, which would tighten things even further, is being delayed and pushed back. So it's a very difficult process to really bet your money on the back of, because so many things get changed in the process of the lobbying. What tends to happen is things get weakened and pushed back as people want to sweat their assets longer. And also, in parallel, you see this advance of engineering solutions, the game is buy yourself some more time, work out a cheaper way of complying, and by the time the regulators have caught up with you, you'll still be one step ahead of the game. So with the 200 gram limit, which I think policymakers thought would be tight, it's now not seen as tight and very flexible. They're now going to try and delay the 80 gram limit for as long as possible and see how they can bring costs of compliance down in the time that they buy themselves. So this is a problem with kind of A, regulations get captured, B, they get there's never as much information in the hands of the policymakers as there is in industry, and C, engineering solutions can and have proven to be actually much easier and cheaper than we anticipated. So you kind of you see this kind of dance between the regulators and the regulated, and the net fact usually is it doesn't have as big an impact as you first thought.
We have a question from Simon. But look, what's the best way to UK to 2020 to try to increase the load on gas power stations? Obviously wasn't helped by the carbon tax decision by the UK earlier this year to reduce that tax down. That tax is now 18 from next April until 2020. It will be £18 a tonne of carbon on top of generation. So that will go some way to to reducing coal burn if gas price kind of permits it. £18 a tonne for reference equals about 7p a therm off gas price when you think about the kind of the coal gas switching levels. So that by itself next year, that will help the situation, but really it's at the vagaries of the market as such. If there's one way to make a difference at a national level, which is the question, it's really to target the capacity mechanism and making sure this coal is not investing to become ID compliant, and that's really the big uncertainty that we've got at the moment about what will actually happen to the capacity market when the first auctions go in December this year. The way it stands at the moment with a 15-year capacity contract that could be awarded to you if you invest to carry on, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think coal power stations will be crazy not to try to apply for that 15 years to stay open, because it's so much money being thrown at them, and the system that's been concocted just seems pretty incredulous. But we are where we are.
Yes, Simon. I guess that one of the things that, as I'm involved in the UK policy making, is that we've raised during the passage of the energy market reform concerns about the effect of the overall effect of the EMR on coal, and I think there is the key thing for us now is the setting of that decarbonisation target in 2016, and there are things we can do, I think, to try and mitigate the effects of the capacity mechanism, and Sandbag and others, I'm sure, will be thinking on this. But really, politically, the biggest thing now that we need to shift to is getting a decarb target set for 2030. That means that we are not allowing 14 gigawatts of coal to be on the system. I don't think we will get 14 gigawatts of coal complying. I think we might get 4, but 4 is still difficult when you think that the national grid, all of their projections going forward show coal almost off the system by 2023. We think that's ridiculous, actually. I don't see any scenario where it's going to be that low, but that's the current thinking. So there's a bit of a wake-up call needed, I think, in the UK to properly, and we will, at least by the end of this year, with the results of this first auction, be in a position of slightly more information. We'll see what people have bid in, how many coal stations have gone for 3-year contracts, how many have gone for 15, if any. I mean, it's still a big call, because CEOs and investors are still human beings, and they still must be trying to read the runes about whether low carbon is going to dominate in EU, or it's going to be a continuing system of some low carbon and a lot of high carbon. And that comes down, I think, to whether you think the policymakers are going to wake up and get serious about those high carbon aspects. One of the things I think in doing this report that's struck me the most is that we have got this successful build out of renewables. There's no doubt about it. It's having an impact. It is curtailing thermal generation, coupled with structural changes which have meant demand is falling. And that's great. I mean, that's a success story. But it's been coupled with everyone burning the cheapest possible fuel in coal to then keep prices low. So Germany's a really interesting case in point. Yes, they're paying quite a lot for their renewables, but they're getting a lot of money back by exporting very cheap lignite to their neighbours, which makes the whole thing more tolerable politically. If you're spending more money on one hand, but you're gaining a lot on the other, it's probably fine. But is that the most sensible approach? Because in carbon intensity terms, that just means you're pretty much standing still. Now, if Germany carries on track, it keeps on with its renewables and demand, and if it's not exporting quite so much coal in the future, this will right itself. But those are quite big ifs, and certainly Dave's been very helpful in helping us understand the extent to which coal exports from Germany could increase. So there is definitely something at a German policy at a national level that needs to be properly thought through, but also then at an EU level, because Germany is so important as the biggest player, we need to be monitoring what's happening more carefully. Now, another question from Matt Finch. I have a broader subjective question. How much of current EU and UK policy do you regard as good, And what policies do you regard as bad and essentially not achieving their targets?
Yeah, I mean, you said about the renewables. I mean, when everyone says about renewables, people think about Germany. That basically in the last few years, every country has now picked up and started investing in renewables to a meaningful way, and that's got to be a clear win. That's putting the infrastructure there for the long term that will stay there and keep the generation going. There's a question about what cost, obviously, but it's worked. It's done the job. It's bringing down emissions. There's no doubt about it. So that's a clear good one. Do you want to do the bad ones?
I mean, I think actually, I'm quite. The other thing to say, and I wanted to say, I should have said this earlier, is that our report actually contains some really good news, and that's if you get the merit order right between coal and gas, and you keep on building out your renewables and you do your demand reduction, this is actually quite easy. You can get, big numbers out of your power sector quickly. You can get down, you can get your emissions down by around 40% relative to 2010.
Yeah.
And you can do that without having to really, apart from continuing with your renewables, the fuel switching is almost instantaneous. It's just capacity shifting. So that, I think those are the numbers I think that were really surprising to me. That just quite how fast we can decarbonise is perhaps often misunderstood. And I think that's got really, really interesting implications for the ETS and the political will to make the ETS stronger. If we can get politicians to understand that decarbonising the power sector in Europe is actually, what we have a huge potential to do quite a lot quite quickly. That should soften some of the opposition. Of course, it all comes then down to at what price. And I'm not naive enough to, to discount that. That is, of course, an issue. But we're not talking. It's not an impossible scenario that we're painting here. And I think one of the next steps for work that we do will certainly be to try and do some more modelling of what kind of carbon prices are needed to get this, to uncover these potential savings, and under what scenarios, and that's something we'll be working on.
Yeah, I mean, in the bigger context where coal today is 18% of total EU CO2 emissions, that number is absolutely immense, and if that opportunity exists, that's just a huge win for the whole of the EU. So this really should be a centre kind of target for policy making that can really make a big impact on CO2 emissions for Europe.
Simon's come back to us, Simon Bullock from Friends of the Earth, with another question. Thanks both for the reply. Note Centrica report out yesterday advocating no 2030 electricity decarb target. Their approach has 150 kilowatt hours by 2030. Could you, Simon, if you're there, could you just type in what you mean by their approach? Because I haven't seen that, but that would be helpful. It would surprise me if Centrica were against a decarb target. Given that their fleet is largely gas, but maybe they are concerned that if coal stays on, then a tight decarb target then pushes off gas even more.
I mean, they're looking to de-invest to sell on their coal plants, so leaves them in a bit of a dodgy situation.
Their gas plants.
Sorry, their coal gas plants.
Yeah. I mean, owners of existing gas plants are, I'm sure, they're really suffering from the overall impact of EU policy at the moment. It's not just policy, of course, it's the gas prices as well. But I guess at this point we should probably say that in 2014 we have seen in the UK temporary switching back to gas, as we've started the year with quite low gas prices as a result of the inventory of gas stored gas being very high. And people stocking up with fear of unrest in the Ukraine.
Yeah, and that's been really big. It's only been for 3 months so far, so it started really kind of around the middle of May to a decent extent. So you're kind of only 3 months in, and it is at the vagaries of gas prices. Until you get there, you don't know what you're actually going to have achieved. So it is looking good news for now, but it could just be a temporary factor depending on what happens in the future. Certainly for the continent, where we've been looking for the continent, it's harder to see that. I mean, they haven't got the additional carbon tax on top that the UK has. So where you're looking at some of the key kind of fuel switching countries, like for example Netherlands, there's there's not an awful lot of evidence that we've seen about gas burns picking up there in the same way as they have in the UK.
That's it for questions.
Okay, we have a hiatus in questions.
So,
Sorry, Simon's clarified what he meant. Oh, okay. And Simon, I'm assuming that it's right that they don't. So they don't believe that a decarb target is necessary, and that their assumptions are that coal will be largely gone, much more gas and less renewables. Well, they would say that, wouldn't they? As a company that both buys and uses and sells gas. And I mean, this is what I suppose we're trying to highlight, is that there are so many moving parts in the policy game at the moment still, even though in the UK we've just gone through a massive round of consultation and new measures being brought in, that it still hasn't clarified the picture. The two things that still remain massively uncertain in the UK are what happens to our coal plant under the ID, and what is the policy on decarbonisation next decade. Is it going to be pull back on renewables, pull back on anything other than gas? And that would certainly be, some people would advocate that. Or is it going to be a more balanced portfolio, or is it going to be a deep green portfolio where we really do push hard on CCS, nuclear, renewables, and see both coal and gas reducing? There's just, despite where we appear to have spent a year trying to sort out our energy policy, there is far too much wriggle room for different governments, different secretaries of state to come in and completely change the emphasis. So, yeah.
Maybe one last question to go on. Peter Owen asked, have you done the costings in your report as well? We haven't done any costings. I'm not quite sure specifically which costings you're kind of going with.
The carbon price, the impact of carbon price, I imagine. What carbon price does it need to switch? We have got there's a box in the report on carbon price, the parameters of the carbon price. Of course, it changes with different fuel price assumptions, but you've got a range in there, haven't you?
Yeah. I mean, at the moment, we're seeing, like we said, there is happening in the UK already, with the carbon tax in the UK being enough to make the switch. On the continent, I mean, with carbon price at €6, there's not much happening on our estimates. If it was €18 gets you to the main bulk of the coal gas switching element at the current gas price. So at the moment, gas price is about €16 a megawatt hour in TTF, which is obviously the continental indicator price. And at €16 a megawatt hour gas price, you do need a carbon price closer to €18 to really kind of shift much more of that generation into gas and away from coal. So even at the lower gas prices, we're a little bit away now. But when the prize on the other side is reducing the whole of the power sector emissions by 11%, that's a huge benefit if you did get there. So I hope that answers the question.
I mean, I think the key political question for me is, how do we encourage this new set of EU policymakers to understand that we should have and can tolerate a higher carbon price, and that will enable us to reach GHG targets cost effectively, and prevent the locking in of investment into high carbon infrastructure. That, people have been saying this in many different ways for many years, and it's still, the fear is this is going to lead to deindustrialization. And part of this is the fact that the ETS covers not just power, obviously, where there's very quick and big potential for decarbonisation, but also industrial sectors where the opposition to high carbon prices is much higher. And when we publish our bigger report later in the year on the state of the ETS, looking now at the first year of this new phase of operation, we are, I think, going to be looking at much more detail about what can we do in those industrial sectors to depoliticize and to try and stop them from blocking a higher price. And I think that's really going to be around industrial policy and CCS policy in particular. So watch this space for a kind of more kind of holistic view of the pricing question. And as I said earlier, we are also as an organisation quite keen to develop our thinking in terms of modelling capacity, and that's something we'll hopefully be looking into over the summer in terms of having our own models that we can model out different impacts of different carbon prices. There are lots of analysts out there, and we use them, and we're good friends with many of them, and some of them may be on the call. But we, and no disrespect, but we think it would be good for us to have our own black box that we can understand and play with, that can be used by the wider NGO community as well.
We tried to open up the black box. You can access all our database, by the way, if you wanted. My email's in there. Give me an email, and I'll be more than happy to send it around. There's no point in doing these things if you can't share them out for other people to draw their own conclusions and make their own analysis.
That's right. We do have a database now of all the power stations in Europe with their fuel type and their status in relation to various air quality restrictions, and we're very happy to share that with people. We would like people to obviously cite it if they use it, but the way to get hold of that is to email us at info@sandbag.org.uk or dave@sandbag.org.uk, and we'll make that available, because I think it's a resource that is hopefully of use for lots of different things, and we'll be using it ourselves going forward, because it's given us a much better ability to look in detail at how the ETS is functioning. So now we've got a nice political question from Mark Johnson about could the UK re-engage with Europe, or at least not quit? EU rulemaking requires EU-wide majorities. Well, I couldn't possibly comment. I mean, obviously, as I think I said earlier, how the UK engages with the 2030 package does have an influence, and we would like, I think, to see much more of that in terms of us taking an active role in shaping the EU agenda. It has to be said, though, DEC have come out with a very good suggestion on cancellation of ETS allowances, which I know, Mark, you have some views about whether that's legal or not. We disagree with you. We think it is legal, but I think that's a sign that certainly DEC is a very engaged a member of the kind of EU policy-making college. So, yeah. Right. There's apparently, I can view how many of you are viewing, and apparently there are still 20 of you out there, which is quite impressive given all the technical hitches we've had. If any of you who haven't asked a question would like to, please do feel free on any aspect of the report. It's gone down to 18, so just my saying that has meant that you've all decided to leave.
It's kind of lunchtime.
It is. People are getting hungry.
Maybe a question here. Maybe Brian will be a minister next year.
Yes, maybe I will. That would be scary, wouldn't it? Anyway, yes, we can speculate, but there's no point. We're still quite away from an election. But yeah, for those people who perhaps don't know, I am a shadow minister in the Lords on energy for the Labour Party, and should we win, when we win, it would be amazingly interesting to be involved in governing DEC. Yeah, that would be great. We're now staring intently at the number of people online to see if we're being entertaining enough to keep your interest.
We've got my juggling balls.
Yes. Look, we don't want to take up any, I guess, time. If there are no other questions that aren't about political issues, Mark, we'll give it 15 seconds because that's the time delay there is on the system before we start to wrap up.
Got the countdown music.
Yeah. I mean, I should just say that before we do wrap up, that there is obviously, this is a report that we've we've spent quite a lot of time over, but as ever, we're always mindful that this is a very complex area, and there are some aspects, especially the modelling, that we would really very much appreciate feedback on, challenge our assumptions, challenge our numbers. We are always listening and open to discussions. We think this is a hugely important area, and we will continue to work on it. Peter, you have another question. Right, the European Commission has concluded the proposed UK capacity market is in line with the EU state aid rules. Scheme aims to ensure sufficient that. Yes, we did touch on that a little bit earlier. That yesterday we saw state aid approval for capacity market. I think we are still concerned that our capacity market may produce some funny results, and actually it could still be subject to a legal challenge if we saw an awful lot of investment going into IED compliance being supported by the capacity market.
Yeah, I mean, the idea about handing out more than 1 year capacity contracts to justify investment that's not really related to, it's more related to EU legislation. It seems kind of overlapping and just weird. So a lot of controversy, a lot of people kind of kicked off when they first awarded the 3-year capacity in there, and then when the UK government came along and defined the 15-year contract as basically that's not actually for new, it was meant to be for a new power station, but all you need to do is spend more than X. That completely changed the definition to a way that now that the coal plant can get a 15-year contract, and where the 3-year looked a little bit weird, the 15-year just looks absolutely kind of crazy. So yeah, sure, that's far from ideal.
But I think, we will we're obviously not privy to discussions going on in boardrooms around the UK about these investment decisions, and I suspect they're all very busy doing the numbers. It might be hard to spend £250 per kilowatt on a clapped out coal station. It might not. I think we don't know.
I mean, for reference, Ratcliffe spent 400 when they did theirs. So the power stations are so old, they need the investment. It's not hard to spend that from a financial perspective. It's just knowing that other legislation isn't going to come in to kind of clobber them and force them out anyway. But if that capacity payment is generous enough, they don't even need to kind of be up the merit order anyway. They can sit there as a peaking plant just from the immenseness of their capacity payment they've been awarded.
Yes. Mark, no, there are no sandwiches. Sorry, no virtual sandwiches from us. I'm sure that we wouldn't mind if everyone else is eating their sandwiches. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for persevering with us, and we will send the presentation round. The report, all the slides of course were drawn from the report, and you'll see the slides, the charts in context in the full report, so we would encourage you to visit the website and have a look at that. Please also look at our policy recommendations or policy options section, see if there's any we've missed, or there's any particular thoughts on which ones might be viable or not viable. We're always very keen to get feedback. I don't think this subject's going to go away, and I think hopefully in October, when we start to revisit the 2030 package again with a new set of actors in the Commission and in the Parliament, we could see some new things emerging. That's certainly what we would like to try and achieve. Yeah. Dave, do you want to say a few final words?
That's probably it, isn't it?
Well, Phil is the man behind the scenes who has had a horrible job of trying to keep this thing on track. This is our very first Google Hangout, and we're going to be sending some feedback to Google, and also perhaps exploring the manual and how it works in a bit more detail. But anyway, thank you for those of you who stayed till the end, and we hope it was useful. We hope the report was useful. We will be very happy to receive feedback, and I'm going to say thank you to everyone at Sandbag who made the report possible and got it out in time, and we will see you all again, I hope, sometime.